Hi everyone, welcome to FWC's virtual public workshop on potential regulation changes for Cownose rays. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us and provide input on this topic. My name is Erin Parker. I'm a regional biologist for the FWC's Division of Marine Fisheries Management, and I'm based in St. Petersburg. Your participation on this issue is important, and we are looking forward to hearing your input. The purpose of these workshops is to gather feedback on potentially establishing regulations specific to the management of Cownose rays in Florida. Currently, there are no regulations that are specific to Cownose rays in Florida, which means general license and harvest limits apply to anyone harvesting or collecting these animals. FWC staff are considering recommendations to establish regulations for the species because research indicates that Cownose ray abundance in some Florida estuaries is declining. Based on Cownose rays biology, specifically their life history, they are susceptible to overfishing. Because of this and the limited regulations currently in place for Cownose rays, management may be warranted to prevent further declines. We are at the preliminary stages of considering regulations that would reverse and prevent further declines and establish conservation measures. Your input is critical to shaping what regulations the Commission considers. Here is the format for this workshop. We will start with a presentation providing an overview of Cownose rays and their biology, why staff are considering regulations at this time, and some possible regulation options for your consideration. After the presentation, if you have any questions or public comments you'd like to share, you can submit comments online on our website or by emailing us at the address shown on this slide. I will reshare these comment options at the end of this workshop. I'll begin the presentation with some background information about Cownose rays and their biology that is relevant for their management. Cownose rays have an extensive range that includes most coastal states in the southeastern U.S., shown on the map here in orange. They are found on both coasts of Florida. There is evidence that the population of Cownose rays in the Gulf is genetically distinct from the population on the U.S. Atlantic coast, and they are in fact separate stocks. This is supported by studies that have tracked the movements of Cownose rays, which observed that Cownose rays in eastern Florida did not travel south of Port St. Lucie, and there are no documented movements between the Gulf and Atlantic. Anecdotally, there is little to no presence of Cownose rays in the Keys. Additionally, there are two different species of Cownose rays in Florida's waters, the American Cownose ray and the Brazilian Cownose ray. The two species are very difficult to tell apart, and they have very similar patterns of growth and reproduction. Most Cownose rays in Florida are American Cownose rays, with Brazilian Cownose rays making up less than 1% of samples. Cownose rays will often form schools ranging in size from a few individuals to several thousand, which makes it easy to target large numbers of individuals at once. This schooling behavior is often associated with migration. This tendency to gather together can also make population declines more difficult to observe. There are differences in movement and migration patterns between the Atlantic and Gulf stocks. Many of the rays on the Atlantic coast winter in Florida to avoid cold temperatures and then migrate north to reproduce in the summer. However, some rays are resident year-round on the east coast of Florida. Cownose rays in the Gulf do not undertake long migrations like those in the Atlantic. They will often make shorter, local migrations to find food or suitable habitat. Cownose rays can reach up to 21 years of age. The age and size at which they mature and reproduce varies by stock. On the Atlantic coast of Florida, they reach maturity at 7 to 8 years old and 34 inches across, while on the Gulf Coast, they mature at 4 to 5 years old and 26 inches across. Females usually only produce one pup at a time, and the gestation time is about a year. They mate soon after giving birth, so they are pregnant nearly year-round. Age at maturity and reproductive timelines are part of what we call the Cownose rays life history. Based on this life history, Cownose rays produce few offspring over their lifetimes. In fact, they have one of the lowest lifetime reproductive capacities of any ray species, similar to that of spotted eagle rays. Their low birth rates result in very slow population growth, slower than that of some other shark and ray species that are listed as prohibited in Florida. This makes Cownose rays particularly vulnerable to overfishing. Cownose rays are considered generalists and feed on a wide range of invertebrates like clams, oysters, crabs, worms, and other animals that live on the sea floor. They have flat, cobblestone-like teeth designed to crush through hard shells. What they can eat is limited by the size of their mouths. If something is bigger than their mouth, like a large oyster, they can't consume it. Cownose rays are known to prefer thin-shelled bivalves like soft-shell clams. Although they can eat commercially valuable species like oysters and hard clams, these make up a very small proportion of their overall diet. Cownose ray stocks have not been formally assessed anywhere in their U.S. range, and there is limited research on the abundance of the species as a whole. Cownose rays are observed in FWC's Fish and Wildlife Research Institute's fishery independent sampling. Though their tendency to form large schools can make population changes difficult to detect, a recent review of 25 years of data collected by the Fishery Independent Monitoring Program indicates that Cownose ray abundances in some Florida estuaries are declining. In the next few slides, I will walk us through the trends in abundance observed in the Gulf Coast fishery independent sampling. We'll start in the north. Here are graphs of the relative abundance from sampling in Apalachicola Bay on top and Cedar Key on the bottom. The black dots represent the median number of Cownose rays per sample in each year, and the dashed line represents the average relative abundance across all years sampled. These plots show that the abundances of Cownose rays in these two estuaries are fairly stable. Also note the scale of the y-axis on the left side of each plot. Because of the small scale, the variations we can see here represent pretty small differences in the number of rays observed in a typical haul year to year. We can contrast this to the trends observed in estuaries farther south on Florida's Gulf Coast. Note the larger scale of the y-axis on these plots compared to the plots on the previous slide. There is some variation in abundance in the earlier years of the study, but there are declines across the time series. In Charlotte Harbor, our data indicates declining abundance began around 2004. For Tampa and Sarasota bays, the declines began after 2011. Although the Sarasota Bay dataset is not as long as the datasets for the other four estuaries, this system is very similar to Tampa Bay, and the trends in ray abundance observed in the two estuaries from 2009 onwards are very similar to each other. These surveys were also conducted in estuaries along Florida's Atlantic coast. However, Cownose rays were not encountered frequently enough to provide us with trends in abundance. Cownose rays tend to spend large amounts of time in shallow, nearshore coastal waters. This makes them a good target for both recreational and commercial fishers using a variety of gear types, including hook and line, cast nets, beach seines, spears, and bows. We have limited data on recreational and commercial fishing effort and harvest directed at Cownose rays. However, we know they are a popular choice for shark bait and sometimes for stone crab traps. They are not commonly harvested for use as food. They are sometimes collected by the marine life trade, though successful breeding under human care means there is not a great demand for wild-caught individuals. The large schools of Cownose rays that form during migrations make for an impressive sight appreciated by ecotourism participants. In Florida, there are no regulations specific to Cownose rays, which means they fall under what is often considered as, quote, default harvest limits. Recreational saltwater fishing license holders are limited to 100 pounds of Cownose rays per person per day. Commercial saltwater fishing license holders do not have a limit on their daily harvest of Cownose rays. Other ray species in Florida that also fall under the default bag limit include blunt-nosed stingrays, butterfly rays, and southern stingrays. However, these species have larger litter sizes than Cownose rays, and butterfly rays may produce 2 litters per year. This means that they are much more resilient to fishing pressure than Cownose rays. There are some larger ray species in Florida, such as the spotted eagle ray, that have long gestations and small litter sizes, similar to Cownose rays. These species are prohibited to harvest. There is little regulation specific to Cownose rays in other parts of their U.S. range. Maryland has banned fishing tournaments for Cownose rays and may implement additional regulations in the near future. Alabama has set a bag limit for skates and rays of 3 per person. No other U.S. states have regulations specific to Cownose rays. Prior to these workshops, staff contacted tackle shop owners, charter captains, marine life endorsement holders, and wholesale dealers to ask their perspectives on cownose rays and the possibility of increasing regulation for this species. Overall, staff have not heard that there is strong interest in targeting cownose rays, though many stakeholders noted that they often hear about cownose rays being used as bait. Multiple people expressed the enjoyment that seeing schools of cownose rays provide to customers on charter trips and tour boats. Opinions mostly ranged from neutral to supportive of some sort of regulation specific to cownose rays, though a small number stated that no change is needed. Some people also expressed opposition to the use of cownose rays as bait. There were also mentions of noticeable declines of cownose ray numbers in areas where they were once seen at high densities. To reverse and prevent further declines in abundance and to implement conservation measures, FWC staff are considering a wide range of conservation measures. These fall into the categories listed on the slide, including listing cownose rays as a prohibited species, listing cownose rays as a marine life species, prohibiting the use of cownose rays as bait, and establishing harvest regulations specific to cownose rays, such as bag and vessel limits, size limits, and prohibited gear. I will discuss each of these options in more detail on subsequent slides, but before I do, I want you to know that many of these regulatory options could be implemented in combination, and these options are not necessarily exclusive. The first possible regulation could be to list cownose rays as a prohibited species under the sharks and rays rule. This would put cownose rays in the same class as other similar species like spotted eagle rays and manta rays, as well as multiple shark species. With this designation, no recreational or commercial harvest would be allowed, including for use as bait. If a cownose ray were caught incidentally, it would have to be released as quickly as possible. In this instance, any collection of cownose rays in Florida state waters would require a marine special activity license, which could authorize limited collection of the animal for purposes like research or educational exhibition in a public aquarium. Making cownose rays a prohibited species would minimize fishing mortality. Another possible management action could be to list cownose rays as a marine life species. This would make cownose rays subject to marine life recreational bag limits and commercial harvest limits and licensing requirements. Recreational collectors are limited to collecting 5 of any marine life species per day and no more than 20 marine life organisms in total per day. However, I'll note that some marine life species have more restrictive limits. There is also a recreational possession limit of 10 organisms of any species and no more than 40 total marine life organisms. For those who possess a marine life endorsement, a commercial saltwater products license, and a restricted species endorsement, there would be no limit on the number of cownose rays they could harvest daily, unless a limit is established. If they are made a marine life species, cownose rays would be required to be landed alive, and collectors' vessels would be required to have a circulating live well that is large enough to hold them and ensure they remain in healthy condition. Making cownose rays a marine life species would minimize fishing mortality to a lesser extent than making them a prohibited species. However, it would allow collections for the aquarium trade and public aquariums, which play an important role in educating the public and building support for marine conservation. The next possible option could be to prohibit the use of cownose rays as bait. This would still allow for cownose rays to be harvested for food or collected for the marine life trade under the current recreational and commercial harvest limits, unless specific harvest limits are established. The primary reason for cownose ray harvest in Florida is for bait. Thus, prohibiting their use as bait would be expected to reduce harvest. The next series of possible management actions are all regulations for harvest. One, some, or all of these possible options could be implemented to create conservation measures related to harvest. First could be adding cownose rays to the Sharks and Rays Rule Chapter and including them in the current daily harvest limits for those species. For non-prohibited sharks and rays named in the Sharks and Rays Rule Chapter, the daily bag limit for recreational and commercial harvest is 1 shark per person. The daily vessel limit is 2 sharks per vessel. This would become 1 shark or cownose ray per person and 2 sharks or cownose rays per vessel. Bag and vessel limits would be expected to reduce the harvest of Cownose rays, but still allow some access to this fishery for commercial harvesters and recreational anglers. Another possible harvest regulation could be a size limit. Generally, minimum size limits are set to increase the likelihood that organisms will have the opportunity to reproduce at least once before they are harvested. Due to differences in the size and maturity between Atlantic and Gulf stocks, it may be appropriate to have different minimum size limits for each coast. To implement separate size limits, a boundary would be established at the Monroe-Miami-Dade county line. Based on the size at maturity, the minimum size limit for the Atlantic could be 35 inches disc width, and for the Gulf, it could be 27 inches disc width. Disc width, or DW for short, is the measurement from wingtip to wingtip, as shown in this illustration. Setting these minimum size limits would increase the likelihood that each female would have an opportunity to contribute to the population before harvest. This could benefit the species because it has a low population growth rate. The last possible harvest regulation we'll present today is creating a prohibited gear for harvesting Cownose rays. If this option is chosen, it would be against regulations to harvest Cownose rays by bow fishing, spearing, or other puncture method. Alternatively, FWC could develop and publicize a best practices recommendation that would discourage this activity but not prohibit it outright. These gear types are highly likely to produce severe or fatal injuries, limiting options for catch and release fishing. As you are considering the various possible regulation options just discussed, there are a few key points we would like you to think about. The goals staff would be pursuing if we recommend establishing regulations for Cownose rays are to 1. Reverse declining abundances and prevent future declines in Florida, and 2. To establish conservation measures that are appropriate for the biology of Cownose rays. FWC data indicate that Cownose rays are not a major source of income, food, or sport, so implementing more conservative regulations would likely have limited negative impacts on commercial and recreational fishermen. The naturally low population growth rate of Cownose rays makes them vulnerable to overfishing. They share this vulnerability with other sharks and rays that are already prohibited from harvest. It also makes their populations less resilient to other disturbances like natural disasters. Given what we know about their low reproductive rates, declining abundances in parts of Florida, and the limited regulations currently in place for this species, developing regulations specific to Cownose rays may be warranted. That concludes our presentation on Cownose rays in Florida and possible options for management. On the next slide, I will review ways that you can ask any questions you may have and provide your public comment, but I first wanted to give a reminder of some of the areas where we are seeking your feedback. We also welcome any other feedback you have related to Cownose rays. We will continue to gather public feedback on possible regulations for Cownose rays, so if you or someone you know would like to provide additional comments, there are more opportunities to weigh in. You can email comments to marine@myfwc.com. Another option is to provide comments through our web form at myfwc.com/saltwater comments. Staff will use public feedback to develop recommendations for rule changes related to Cownose rays. Also, all feedback will be summarized and presented to the Commission when they consider possible regulations. If we move forward with recommendations, we expect a proposed final rule hearing to occur at the August 2026 FWC Commission meeting. To get updates on this topic and more news and information from FWC, use the QR code on this slide. I would like to say again that we appreciate your feedback as it provides important information staff considers when developing rule recommendations for the Commission. That concludes this workshop. Thank you again to everyone for taking the time to watch this presentation.